Hey everyone, it's Samuel. And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, the Way of Mercy Monk subclass. In the Wilds, the Gloomstalker. And in the Tavern, what would you do if there was a meteor strike? Well, hey there, everyone. I hope everybody out there is having an excellent day. Excited to continue our series on the new subclasses which were released in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. We covered the Circle of Wildfire Druid, which I think is one of my favorites. I thought it was my favorite, but then as we dove into the Way of Mercy subclass for the monk, I think I might have a new favorite. So flavorful and lots of storytelling potential here. And even if you're not in this subclass, it just gives some great ideas for different sorts of characters that you could play. So I'm excited to dive into all of that with you. Before we get into the Prime Material though, just some housekeeping to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. We still have our quest for 1K going on Twitter. We're about 39 followers as of the recording of this podcast from our next giveaway, which will give the lucky winner all of our Patreon supplements. It will also include a pack of Chessex dice from Greenleaf Geek and a color miniature of a hyena folk from the folks at Hero Forge. And of course, once we finally do get to that 1,000 follower milestone, there'll be a massive giveaway at that point. So if you're not following, go ahead and check that out. You might win some awesome TTRPG goodness. Remember to rate and review the podcast wherever you happen to be listening to it. That helps spread the word about Plot Hooks to more people. And if the show has really offered you something, then we'd appreciate it if you could check out our Patreon. That's a way for you to give back to us and a lot of other content creators in a variety of different spaces to be able to support the content that you enjoy. That really helps us keep the lights on around here and keep pumping out content for you all. And speaking of content, I'm excited to announce that after months, literally, of technical difficulties, we're finally back on track with Plot Hooks Adventures. The season finale, which was supposed to air a couple of months ago already, is now about halfway done with the editing process and should be done and airing sometime in February. That's going to bring the conflict between the High Caracan Council and the citizens of the continent into full focus, and it's going to set the stage for an epic confrontation in Season 2. I also want to announce that because of the upcoming Disaster Hamsters release, we're going to be taking next week off of the podcast. Going to be hard at work with the editing process, preparing this supplement for playtesting so that it can go out in the best form possible. I'm so excited with how it's turning out, and I can't wait to share it with you all. Be sure to stay tuned to our social media, and patrons especially will get lots of sneak peeks as the time gets closer. But without any more long-winded announcements, let's get into the Prime Material. Again, we're continuing our series on subclasses that are out of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. And we don't want to just give a rundown of the way that the class works mechanically, though we will do that as we go throughout this series. But just as a reminder, our focus here is storytelling. That's our tagline, is everyone can be a storyteller. And subclasses can be a great vehicle to tell stories with. They add variety to the mechanics of the base classes and add more inspiration for creativity and opportunities to be creative as we're going throughout our D&D stories. And today, with the Way of Mercy, we're delving into our first monk subclass. Monks are interesting to tell stories with in D&D in general, in my opinion, because they're kind of outside of the typical trope space of classic sword and sorcery. Other classes, make a lot of sense. Wizards are classic. Clerics are classic. The kind of holy fighter that a paladin is classic. You have fighters and barbarians. Those are all classic tropes. But the monk is something that's a little bit outside of what I typically think of when I think of this style of fantasy. But they've pretty much always been a part of Dungeons & Dragons way back whenever it was known as the Mystic. And the way that it connects to the overarching magical world that is the settings which Dungeons & Dragons are typically set in is that monks harness ki in order to achieve their goals, which in a D&D sense is the natural magical energy that is housed in living things. One of the classic shticks, I guess you could say, about D&D is that magic suffuses everything. Almost like the Force in a way. Magic just flows through everything. And the part of that magical energy that goes through a person or another living creature is called ki for the monks. And through study and training, monks can tap into this power to produce magical effects or push their physical forms past normal capabilities. Most of these powers have to do with controlling your own ki and boosting your own abilities thereby, or producing effects from yourself, or perhaps even blocking the flow of energy in your opponents. But for the Monk of the Way of Mercy, this effect seems to be amplified even further, because you gain the ability to affect ki so much that, straight out of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, you, quote, learn to manipulate the life force of others. Reading this paragraph straight out of the supplement, monks of the Way of Mercy learn to manipulate the life force of others to bring aid to those in need. They are wandering physicians to the poor and hurt. However, to those beyond their help, they bring a swift end as an act of mercy. Those who follow the Way of Mercy might be members of a religious order, administering to the needy and making grim choices rooted in reality rather than idealism. Some might be gentle-voiced healers, beloved by their communities, while others might be masked bringers of macabre mercies. The walkers of this way usually don robes with deep cowls and often conceal their faces with masks, presenting themselves as the faceless bringers of life and death. I find this very interesting. The monk life is something which is very closely connected to things like monasteries and various communal traditions where of course individuals can separate themselves from the world, but often they're doing it as a group. Here, this seems to be a much more isolated tradition. While you of course could have a monastery that had these beliefs that trained these individuals and then sent them out into the world, I love the idea of just this being an individual monk, a traveling adventurer who is going around, and they take up an apprentice, and they pass on this Way of Mercy to the next individual, and then it gets passed off to the next individual after that, where It is something that is constantly passed on, but it is taught by an individual relationship between master and student. It's not actually connected to an overarching community. Because this just feels so isolating to me. You literally, at level 3, you get this cowl and mask, which you often wear as you're performing your duties. And I think herein, just right at the beginning, is the kicker for telling stories with this particular subclass. And as I mentioned earlier in the beginning, this adds a lot of inspiration for me for telling stories in other veins too. We don't often see this individual master and student relationship. We're often affiliated with larger groups, whether it be rogues affiliated with thieves' guilds, or clerics affiliated with temples, or wizards affiliated with mages' colleges, or bards with bardic colleges, or bands. Community is just built into a lot of our backstories. And even some of the tragic ones, a lot of the times the story there is community being lost in some way, such as being kicked out of a particular community or losing them in a tragedy. Of course, the most interconnected form of community would be one's family. And, we all know the jokes about adventurers having their family killed, and that's sending them off of a path of exploration and redemption or revenge. I think it's just fascinating to have a character that learns this way from a traveling monk. Just learns as an apprentice under them, traveling around to different villages, working to aid in times of sickness and bring healing to as many as they can. These people, as they travel, could be well respected, and the master and the apprentice, as they go around, could be welcomed into different areas, or they could be shunned and hated, perhaps even seen as the bringer of certain atrocities, despite the fact that they're going to the place that the atrocities are already happening in order to help. I just really connected with this particular background with this subclass. And as we go through it, I think you'll see why. At 3rd level, which is whenever you get your particular subclass as a monk, you gain 3 different features. One is entitled Implements of Mercy, which gives you proficiency in the insight and medicine skills, and you gain proficiency with the herbalism toolkit. And you also get that special mask, which I mentioned earlier, which you often wear when using the features of this subclass. There's some suggestions in the book about what the mask could appear like. It could be like a raven or black and white. It could have a crying visage or a laughing visage. Could appear to be like a skull or like a butterfly. Or, of course, you could also just determine what your mask looks like itself. But here, these are just things that you get as you're starting out, as you've been taught how to use this, however you decided to do it, whether it's this individualistic method or if you were trained in a particular community. You're given these particular tool sets and skills to be able to go out and offer mercy. The second feature you get at 3rd level is Hand of Healing. And that is paired with the 3rd, which we'll get to in a second, called Hand of Harm. But Hand of Healing says that your mystical touch can mend wounds. As an action, you can spend 1 key point to touch a creature and restore a number of hit points equal to a roll of your martial arts die plus your wisdom modifier. And when you use your flurry of blows, you can replace one of the unarmed strikes with a use of this feature without spending a key point for the healing. So this gives you the ability to just turn your key into healing for individuals. And I like that second part as well. So you can be fighting hand to hand alongside the barbarian or whatnot, fighting against a massive monster, and you can use one of your flurry of blows attacks to reach over and touch the barbarian and give them a little bit of healing, in addition to trying one more time to hit the big bad. Conversely, Hand of Harm is that you could use your ki to inflict wounds. When you hit a creature with an unarmed strike, you could spend 1 ki point to deal extra necrotic damage equal to 1 roll of your martial arts die plus your wisdom modifier. And you could use this feature only once per turn. And both of these features really play into the aspect which was mentioned about controlling life force. If ki is this magical energy that's flowing through living things and you can control it so much in yourself, well, in this case, when you're healing and when you're hurting, it's not that you're necessarily pushing out harmful energy or healing energy from yourself. It's that you're controlling the life force, the ki within this other individual in order to accomplish a desired effect, either healing or harm. And we'll see that theme going through where most of the features of this subclass are paired in that way. You have one effect that heals and one effect that harms. And I also like the idea of a character where perhaps you refuse to use one of those options. Maybe you have the particular ability to harm, but you choose not to. You're not a pacifist per se. You still use your normal martial arts in order to inflict damage, but you just don't want to actually affect the ki of another person so violently from within like that. Perhaps this is against the character's beliefs. So instead, you just always use this healing feature. Becomes almost like Katara and bloodbending in Avatar: The Last Airbender. It was an ability that she had. It's a feature that the character has, but she chooses not to use it. She chooses to use the control of the water that she has to attack from the outside. She doesn't want to use this other method of attack which she perceives as evil. Conversely, you could be an individual who perhaps your master was killed in this master-apprentice type of relationship that we're talking about. Maybe you were going around to different towns or different cities in the middle of plagues, and like we said, they just hated you because they thought that you two were a harbinger of coming demise. And eventually someone got so out of hand that they rose up and killed the master. And now the apprentice, the character that you would be playing in this particular scenario, is going around in the adventuring party, refusing to do any sort of healing work or anything like that until they get revenge for their master. At 6th level, you get Physician's Touch. It says, you can administer even greater cures with a touch, and if you feel it's necessary, you can use your knowledge to cause harm. When you use Hand of Healing on a creature, you can also end one disease or one of the following conditions affecting the creature: blinded, deafened, paralyzed, poisoned, or stunned. Also, when you use Hand of Harm on a creature, you can subject that creature to the poisoned condition until the end of your next turn. So what this feature does is it essentially just beefs up your same Hand of Harm and Hand of Healing 3rd level features that you already got. And this is very flavorful too, because this really shows your depth, your growth in the ability to reach out and affect the life force of another. Now it's just not healing a wound. Now you can reach out and make a person not paralyzed anymore. Now you can reach out and instead of just dealing necrotic damage as you hit them, now you can give that creature disadvantage on their attacks because of the poison condition, where their life force is so shaken up inside of them, it's like they're under the effects of a toxin. I love it when subclasses make it really clear how you're growing in the particular aspect that's key to that particular subclass, and that's the case here. At 11th level, you get Flurry of Healing and Harm, again mirrored in this way. You can now mete out a flurry of comfort and hurt. When you use Flurry of Blows, you can now replace each of the unarmed strikes with a use of your Hand of Healing without spending key points for the healing. In addition, when you make an unarmed strike with Flurry of Blows, you can use Hand of Harm with that strike without spending the key point for Hand of Harm. You could still only use Hand of Harm once per turn. Again, now you're still growing. Now, when you spend one key point to do Flurry of Blows, you get 2 uses of Hand of Healing for free. And now, whenever you hit with a Flurry of Blows attack, you can inflict the necrotic damage without spending an extra key point. You're now so much more in control of your own ki that you're able to much more effectively reach out and affect the life force of others. And the final feature that you get for the Way of Mercy is Hand of Ultimate Mercy, which you get at 17th level. This says, your mastery of life energy opens the door to the ultimate mercy. As an action, you can touch the corpse of a creature that died within the last 24 hours and expend 5 key points. The creature then returns to life, regaining a number of hit points equal to 4d4 plus your wisdom modifier. If the creature died while subject to any of the following conditions, it revives with them removed: blinded, deafened, paralyzed, poisoned, and stunned, the same as before. Once you use this feature, you can't use it again until you finish a long rest. This is an incredibly powerful feature. It essentially gives you every long rest a free resurrection. You are so powerful with your ki that you can build it up with inside you, since it does take 5 key points to use, and reach out and re-energize the magical energy which is fading over the 24 hours since this creature passed and bring it back to life. Whole new ground for a monk and for a martial class in general, as far as my knowledge goes. I like this idea of being the end game in a long-term campaign where you are this individual that's trying to seek revenge for your master who was unjustly slain, or perhaps even seeking to surpass their master or figure out a way to perhaps do more than their master could. Maybe their master couldn't save enough people, and their master just died very unfulfilled because they just didn't feel like they could save enough people. And now you as the apprentice are going through life trying to figure out how you can do something that they could not. And in this kind of feature is a great end game for that sort of story. But again, this doesn't even have to be for a monk. The ideas which came to me as we were thinking about this particular class could be used in a variety of different subclasses. I think it's a really unique subclass. It's very cool visually, just having that cowl and cape and being this individual person that's been traveling around. And heck, it even provides a great story of why would this person join an adventuring party, especially if you're going with the master and apprentice trope. For what reason would they join up with a larger group? Would they show their face at all, or would they keep their mask on a la the Mandalorian all the time? There's so many opportunities to tell awesome stories with this particular subclass, and just thinking about it for a while will give you a lot of different ideas for how to use different aspects of this to build into your character. So what do you think? Are you interested in building a Way of Mercy monk? Are any of these types of tropes things that you'd be interested in playing with other subclasses? What do you think? We'd love to hear from you. Contact us on social media. But for now, I think that's about all the time we have in the Prime Material today. Let's head over to the wilds. here in the wilderness. Today we're going to be looking at the gloomstalker. Gloomstalkers were made famous, of course, by Critical Role, and I guess I shouldn't even say made famous because they're a Matthew Mercer original creature, and he's used them to great effect on that program. But they were finally officially released with the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount in the Munster section of that module. Quoting directly from there, a gloomstalker is a terrifying winged predator resembling a wyvern composed of twisting shadows with glowing eyes and dagger-like teeth. Hailing from the cursed lands of the Shadowfell, these nightmarish creatures hunt the barrens of that desolate plain, freezing prey in their tracks with their woeful shrieks before pulling them into the skies with their talons to be ripped apart and devoured. They sound friendly. But hey, with that description, with how creepy and amazing they look, they are just excellent monsters with which to set a tone, to establish an environment. They're such evocative creatures, walking in with this entity which is like wyvern-sized, winged, dripping shadow with massive teeth and glowing eyes, blending into the shadow around them. Excellent creatures just to set the tone that you want. Whether that be wanting to make something feel very ominous or wanting to have them stalking the party and make it very horror-oriented, or whether or not you just want to show the party that being in the particular location they are is no joke, these are excellent creatures to use. As far as actual statistics, they're a large monstrosity, challenge rating of 6, AC of 15, hit points of 90, a 40-foot walk speed, and an 80-foot fly speed. So you're not really outrunning this thing at all. And as their innate connection to the Shadowfell might have clued you into, they are very connected with Shadow. Their dark vision is incredibly good. It's 240 feet. And they love congregating in these shadowy areas where they can hide. Conversely, they're very averse to sunlight. They not only have a vulnerability to radiant damage, but they also have sunlight sensitivity, where while in sunlight it's got disadvantage on attack rolls and perception checks that rely on sight, giving this pretty powerful foe a rather good counterplay whenever you've got party members that have the ability to make very bright light sources. You can encounter them in packs and not just individuals as well. The lore says that larger packs of 10 or more are called frenzies, which is a great plural name that's almost as good as a murder of crows. I'm not sure what your players have done to you if you decide to throw 10 of these creatures at them, but hey, if they can cast sunlight on an area, that should help out a lot. But this aspect of them makes them great in the Shadowfell, this whole connection to the shadow element, the dark. Not so much in the Underdark per se. You could use them there, of course. I'm always a little averse to large flying creatures in the Underdark. And these especially, they seem very much like above-ground monsters to me, and maybe just that's my own biases. But I think they're great in environments like the Shadowfell or in apocalyptic regions. A lot of our settings have these regions where from a past war or a past apocalyptic event in some way, you're now got this really desolate, terrible landscape, and if the party happens to be trying to traverse through there, then gloomstalkers coming out there at night I think would fit very well. As far as actions are concerned, they do have a bite attack and a claw attack, which both deal necrotic damage in addition to their slashing and piercing damage, which I really like that feel of it's hurting you with its shadowy death. It also can snatch up creatures with its talons, dealing slashing damage and necrotic damage and grappling and restraining the target as it picks it up. But perhaps the most potent of their attacks is their Shriek, which recharges on a 6. Each enemy within 60 feet of the gloomstalker that can hear it has to succeed on a DC 13 Constitution saving throw or be paralyzed until the end of the enemy's next turn. That's an absolutely bonkers ability. The DC, of course, isn't very high, and it's fairly easy to make compared to some other DCs. But being paralyzed until the end of your next turn is a real beating, especially when this is a creature that can go up and pick you up with its talons and begin to carry you away. This is something that could be used to great effect to really have some difficult combat encounters whenever a party is fighting more than one of these. You could have some really interesting stories of a party being split, of one party member being carried away while the rest of the party tries to get them back. And I don't think that's OP necessarily, because even the person that's restrained and being carried away loses their paralysis at the end of their next turn, so a max of 2 turn cycles later they can attempt to escape from the clutches of the gloomstalker. But if you don't want to have the gloomstalker being an individual hunter or a really difficult combat encounter with multiples, I love the idea of these being mounts. They were actually used as such according to the lore in the past, and I feel like this has the same effect of like the Nazgul riding on their fell beasts. Not only do they sort of look like that, but you just think that whenever your villain is riding on something that is awful and terrible, it makes them seem even scarier, because you realize all of a sudden that, wow, they really are bad. They tamed that terrible beast. And having a lich or a necromancer or whatever it may be, some entity from the Shadowfell riding around on top of one of these gloomstalkers with shadow dripping off of it, that's just an amazing visual and really gives that oomph behind the description of the party's encounter with this particular big bad. And on top of that, these creatures actually have a very high wisdom. It's actually their second highest skill. They have a 22 strength, but a 17 wisdom. That plus proficiency in perception gives them a passive perception of 16 and a +6 to all perception checks. I love the idea of these being the hunting dogs of an evil entity, being the things that the big bad sends out, or just that a generic evil tracker sends out. Maybe if you want it to actually be smaller than the individual, maybe this is a giant person that sends out these gloomstalkers to hunt for the party. But even if they're just a medium, typical humanoid size, being able to send out a gloomstalker, hunting the party, tracking them across terrain, is a really fascinating aspect. Imagine being hunted by a gloomstalker, not just because the gloomstalker is a beast that is annoyed that you're in its terrain or just wants to eat, but because this beast was commanded to. So I really love the idea of gloomstalkers, and I think they'd be an excellent addition to just about any of our campaigns. But I think that's about all the time we have in the wilds today. Let's head away from this gloomy place and head back to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if there was a meteor strike? You know, sometimes we don't even think about space. But technically, in every prime material we build, unless it's otherwise specified, that prime material in our setting is on a planet. And even if it's a flat Earth style scenario, still there's generally some sort of space up there, right? If there's moons in the sky, if there's stars in the sky, either that is something which is fabricated by the gods or the cosmos in some sort of way, or it's an indication of more world out there, that there's actual space out there in the midst of this prime material. And if there's actual space, that means there's stuff in space, and there could be meteor strikes. The most blunt way of using this particular trope is a catastrophic event. A meteor strike hits a town, destroys it, kicks up a dust cloud which affects crops in a larger region. Perhaps it hits a lake or a large body of water like an ocean, triggering a tidal wave which has catastrophic effects on the environment. Being hit by a large object from outer space can trigger any number of effects on the setting. And there's been, goodness knows, countless movies and stories about this particular trope, where humans are having to deal with either trying to prevent this from happening or dealing with the aftermath after it has. But what I find just as interesting is, what are the various cultures' reactions to this in the setting? There's going to be a lot of people out there in a medieval setting that don't have a real good concept of what a meteor is. All they're going to know is something fell from the sky and blew something up, and the smarter people out there and the more educated people out there are explaining exactly what it is, but there's going to be some people that might not believe that. And remote cultures who don't have any sort of interaction with a highly educated scientific school, they're going to develop their beliefs in isolation. It creates a really interesting anthropological discussion, and you could have a lot of fun creating different cultural reactions to the same event. Heck, this could even be part of the main plot of an arc where this event occurs, this meteor strike happens, and the party has to deal with the immediate after effects of that. But now as they're traveling around, they're meeting people. As they're just traveling through the woods, they're meeting a clan of druids that now perhaps are, heck, to use our other subclass that we've covered, now are beginning to connect with their wildfire spirits after the massive blaze that was created nearby after the fiery rock fell from the sky. Now, we do have to be careful when doing this kind of thing, because even whenever cultures are less educated in a sense, where they don't know what a meteor is, that doesn't mean that they're stupid. This is a very important distinction that we unfortunately see a lot of people not getting in the real world as well. And that's why I'm careful to use the term educated and not dumb. Because a particular culture adopting a belief regarding a specific event or trigger might mean that, yes, because of their lack of education, they don't actually know what a meteor is or what a comet is or what an asteroid is, but they're smart enough to think logically about what happened and formulate their own opinions about it based off of their own preset opinions and beliefs. So it can be a delicate balance of trying to create this sort of scenario while still making sure that you don't create a culture that is dumb. You create a very respectful culture that just happens to have less contact with higher education than the giant metropolis on the continent with 3 wizards' colleges. So take that grain of salt if you decide to use this particular plot hook, but I think it would be an excellent opportunity to explore the anthropology in your setting and just create some great scenarios about dealing with the aftermath of a meteor strike. But I think that's about all the time we have on this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Thank you all very much for listening. Be sure to rate and review the podcast. Check us out on Patreon. Check out our social media. And as always, thanks from the whole Plot Hooks team I'm Samuel. Thanks from Matt, Mike, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again in a couple weeks for another episode of Plot Hooks.